Aegon Targaryen had never once felt fear in his short but tumultuous life, not on the day he first mounted Balerion the Black Dread, nor on the night he dreamt of Valeria's doom, nor when his sisters joined him by his side to conquer Westeros. Yet as the frosty winds howled from the far north, carrying whispers of horrors older than men's memory, Aegon felt a disturbance ripple through his being. It was a subtle, sharp pang of dread that defied reason. Whether it was the blood of old Valyria coursing through his veins that allowed him to sense this, or some deeper, more terrible knowledge passed along in dragon dreams, he could not say. But he knew something was stirring beyond the wall, something that threatened not only his ambitions but the whole of the 7 kingdoms he had come to claim. He had landed upon the shores of Westeros with grand intent, to forge a new kingdom under Targaryen rule, a single realm that would rival all others in history. Lords and knights, small folk and kings alike would bend the knee or be destroyed. But only days into his war of conquest, strange reports found their way into his war council's tent. Men who had ventured north with the Night's Watch began to speak of living shadows with eyes like pale blue stars, of corpses that walked and carried swords of ice, of a deadly and unnatural cold that froze the limbs and shattered morale. Most people dismissed these tales as folk legends or superstitions, but Aegon's instincts told him otherwise. He was no fool. If the stories had only come from the Night's Watch, he might have disregarded them as tall tales born of endless nights atop the wall. But when roving merchants from White Harbor arrived with talk of strange sightings, the same pale shapes drifting through the winter snows, Aegon's resolve hardened. Cautious by nature, he chose to heed the warnings. With the subtlety of a budding conqueror, he sent his loyal friend and rumored bastard half-brother, Oris Baratheon, to investigate while he and his sisters continued to bring the South under heel. It was wise to keep an ear on the wind, especially when one's claim to kingship depended on control and knowledge. Oris journeyed north, accompanied by a small retinue of skilled knights and men-at-arms. Word reached Aegon weeks later. Oris had found something dire, and was even now racing back south to share what he had witnessed. Aegon had been in the midst of diplomatic dealings with the lords of Cracklaw Point, who had chosen to bend the knee willingly, hoping to gain favor with the new rising power. Still, with the swirl of rumors and the foreboding chill in the air, the conqueror could focus on little beyond Oris' return. When Oris finally appeared in Aegon's camp, the man's face was pale and etched with horror. This was a man famed for his courage in the thick of battle, fearless upon the parapets of Storm's End. But fear flickered in his eyes when he spoke of the pale, gaunt figures he had glimpsed just beyond the gift. Men of the Night's Watch had tested sword and arrow against them, only for the blades to shatter against armor of unnatural frost. Oris had seen the flash of a blade seemingly carved from ice that froze the blood of a strong knight in a single blow. And there was more. The others, or White Walkers as the small folk called them, commanded an army of dead men, wights, raised by twisted sorcery. They marched in silent ranks, unfeeling to pain or terror. Yet what alarmed Oris most was how swiftly they seemed to multiply. Every time a brother of the Night's Watch fell, the corpse soon rose again, blank-eyed and lethal, to join the ranks of the others. A single defeat could become a cataclysm if the living were not careful. Aegon recognized the significance of Oris' words. Though he craved a realm united under Targaryen rule, he had not come to destroy Westeros. He did not wish to reign over a kingdom of the dead. Nor did he desire to see the 7 kingdoms, soon to be his, decimated by a threat out of ancient legend. Duty was entwined with ambition. If he did not act, there would be no kingdom to forge. In that moment, Aegon Targaryen resolved that the war of conquest would be waged on 2 fronts. The petty kings of Westeros would have a choice. They could kneel to him now, or they could face doom unimaginable when the White Walkers marched south. This was not a vain threat. It was a promise shaped by the creeping chill that had been spoken of in darkness and hushed rumor. He summoned his sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys, to discuss what must be done. Visenya, stern and formidable, was measured in her response. Hers was the voice of caution. They could not simply abandon the ongoing conquest to fly north. There were too many lords who would seize any sign of weakness, any opportunity to break free. Yet Rhaenys, lithe and quick with a smile that could turn deadly, spoke of the power of dragons against the creatures of ice. They were Targaryens, scions of Valyria. Had their ancestors not tamed the 14 flames? Had they not survived the doom? Surely, Rhaenys said, the White Walkers could not stand against dragonfire. At this, Aegon's mind raced with possibilities. They would continue their efforts in the south, but with a renewed imperative: unite the lords, bend them to the Targaryen cause, and swiftly turn their banners northward. It would be an ultimatum: join me, or perish at the hands of both dragon and darkness. The impetus of a threat beyond mortal reckoning might be the key to forging the alliances that would otherwise require years of bloodshed. This, he believed, was the path to a quicker, more decisive conquest. The course was set. Aegon sent swift messengers by raven to Harrenhal, where Harren the Black ruled from his monstrous castle. Aegon's earlier dealings with Harren had been minimal, overshadowed by the giant fortress's impenetrable walls. However, Valyrian's flames had a knack for reducing even the mightiest towers to rubble. Now, those same flames might be directed against foes more frightening than any mortal king. Aegon gave Harren an option. If Harren would submit and pledge his swords, those swords would march north to protect the realm from an unspeakable evil. If Harren refused, Valyrian would turn Harrenhal into molten ruin, an example to all who clung stubbornly to the idea of petty independence. Harren refused, as many expected. His pride, as black as his name, would not allow him to kneel. Aegon took only one day to gather his host before mounting Valyrian. Beside him flew Visenya on Vhagar and Rhaenys on Meraxes. The newly sworn lords of Crackclaw Point and their men marched below. The approach to Harrenhal seemed a mere formality. Everyone knew the end. The massive fortress might have once been thought impregnable against siege engines, but against dragons, stone walls offered no safe refuge. They arrived on a day of unseasonable cold, the sky overcast and bleak. When Valyrian released his black fire upon Harrenhal's towers, men screamed as the stone ran molten and the high walls cracked. Harren the Black, defiant to his final breath, died consumed by flame, his lineage extinguished in a single night of horror. Thus fell the greatest fortress in the Riverlands, and thus rose the legend of Aegon the Conqueror, the man who would burn kings rather than see the realm divided against an ancient foe. News of Harrenhal's fall spread quickly across the Riverlands. The sight of dragonfire was terrifying and seemed unstoppable. Most houses of the Trident bent the knee in rapid succession, not only out of fear but out of a pragmatic desire for survival. Aegon did not linger. He installed Edmund Tully, the first to have joined him, as Lord Paramount of the Trident, and gave him a dire command. Ready your men for war, not just any war, but one that might decide the fate of the living. Edmund, shaken by the demonstration at Harrenhal, vowed to raise his banners without hesitation. Next, Aegon turned his gaze westward, toward the Ironborn who still held dominion over the Riverlands in name alone. But events in the north were escalating. Ravaged men of the Night's Watch, battered and exhausted, once again sent word. The threat was growing. Word had reached Castle Black that a stronghold as far south as the Last Hearth had been attacked in the night by pale foes. The Umber warriors had managed to drive them back, but only barely. More ominous was the fact that the slain rose again to fight at the White Walker's side, leaving the living short on manpower and weaker after every confrontation. Time was running short. It was then that Aegon decided on an unorthodox strategy. Rather than taking the time to break the strength of every southern lord who might resist him, he would offer them a new vow. Join me against this threat, and your lands and titles will be confirmed under the new Targaryen realm. Refuse and suffer dragonfire. Rumors abounded that the White Walkers could only be harmed by dragonsteel, Valyrian steel, the older name rumored in half-forgotten texts, or dragonfire. Dragons had thus become more than conquerors' weapons. They were the last, best hope for the realm's survival. He would handle the greatest threats to his conquest first. The three major kings still defying him were Loren Lannister of the Rock, Myrnine Gardner of the Reach, and Argilac the Arrogant of the Stormlands. He had already sowed the seeds of alliance or submission across the Riverlands. The Vale, where House Aegon watched the Targaryen maneuvers with both awe and alarm, and the Crownlands. The north was in flux, too concerned with the living dead at their doorstep to meddle in southern squabbles. Torrhen Stark, the king in the north, had not yet declared what stance he would take. But Aegon had a sense that the wolf might bend the knee if the threat from beyond the wall proved as dire as rumored. First to fall, ironically, would be Argilac Durrendon. The Storm King had no love for Targaryens, but Aegon could not afford to leave Storm's End behind as a bastion of defiance. He also feared that Argilac's pride might blind him to the encroaching danger from the north. Aegon resolved to give him one more chance before the storm broke. When the Targaryen envoy, led by Oris Baratheon, arrived bearing Aegon's terms, a swift submission and a promise to join the coming war, the Storm King's arrogance flared like lightning. Argilac not only refused but maimed Aegon's envoy in a fit of rage. The conqueror's patience snapped. Summoning Oris, who had his own claim to Argilac's ancestral line through rumored bastard blood, Aegon bestowed upon him the Targaryen host and the authority to break the stormlands if they would not bend. Soon the fields outside Storm's End were aflame. Argilac, known for his bravery in open battle, sallied forth to meet Oris, refusing to cower behind high walls. At first, the Storm King seemed to gain ground. His cavalry charges were fierce, and the stormy winds favored the defenders of the Stormlands, while Targaryen foot soldiers struggled through muddy fields. However, the outcome was never truly in doubt. Mare axes descended from the sky, unleashing a rain of fire that scattered Argilac's knights. Argilac himself fought to the death, refusing to retreat behind the fortress walls. Victorious, Oris seized Storm's End. By Aegon's decree, Oris took Argilac's daughter as his wife and was granted the Stormlands as his own to govern, adopting the sigil and words of House Baratheon. The message to all of Westeros was clear: submit or share in Argilac's fate. Yet Aegon did not linger to savor the triumph. He left Oris to secure the Stormlands and quickly turned his attention to the west, where two kings, Loren of the Rock and Mern of the Reach, had allied against him. They fielded an army rumored to be 60,000 strong, the largest host the continent had seen in centuries. Aegon understood the necessity of subduing these mighty realms, for if he did not, and he marched north without their submission, they might exploit his absence and fracture the nascent kingdom he aimed to protect from the White Walkers. Thus, the Targaryens and their loyal supporters marched with haste. Rhaenys and Visenya soared overhead, scouting the terrain, while Aegon and his ground forces pressed forward. They met the combined might of the Westerlands and the Reach near the Blackwater Rush in what would become the legendary Field of Fire. The battle began at dawn under a clear sky, the sun beating down upon tens of thousands of spears. King Loren and King Mern believed their overwhelming numbers could quickly break Aegon's lines before the dragons had full effect. They launched a furious assault. Indeed, the sheer volume of their cavalry nearly overwhelmed the Targaryen vanguard. But as soon as the lines collided, three shadows eclipsed the sun: Balerion, Vhagar, and Mare axes, black silhouettes against a golden sky. The dragons unleashed a torrent of flame that consumed entire companies in moments. The field, ripe with tall, dry grass, erupted into a blaze that trapped many of the allied soldiers. By midday, the once proud host of the Reach and the Rock lay in charred ruin. King Mern Gardner perished in the flames, leaving House Gardner extinct. King Loren Lannister fled, escaping with fewer than 1,000 men. The next morning, he bent the knee before Aegon Targaryen rather than watch his bloodline be extinguished. In exchange, Aegon spared Loren and named him Lord Paramount of the Westerlands. The Reach, leaderless, soon pledged fealty to the Targaryens as well. The Tyrells, stewards of Highgarden, opened the gates and bent the knee, taking up the mantle of Lords Paramount of the Reach. Now the south was secured. The mightiest kings had bent or burned. Yet Aegon found himself with no time to rest. Ravens from the north brought ever more dire messages. Another incursion of White Walkers had struck a distant mountain keep in the Frostfangs. The men of the Watch were stretched thin. Torrhen Stark, the king in the north, had recalled all his bannermen, preparing the largest host he could muster to face the threat. But wise men knew mortal steel offered scant protection against the others. The conqueror wasted no time. He gathered what strength he could from the subdued kingdoms. From Dorne, no submission had yet come, and he had neither time nor men to invade that desert land. Instead, he sent an embassy offering a truce. Aegon's terms were simple. Dorne would not raise arms against him or attempt to expand into the chaos, and in return they might remain independent for now. A lesser victory, but necessity demanded compromise. The Dornishmen made no immediate reply, but they did not march against him, which was victory enough for the moment. Thus, Aegon Targaryen, with a united realm at his back, minus Dorne, began the long march north. His sisters flew overhead, their dragons trailing fire and smoke across the sky, a symbol of the unstoppable force now coming to confront an ancient evil. Armies parted for them. The small folk knelt in wonder, whispering prayers not just to the Seven but to the old gods as well, hoping these Targaryen dragon lords truly had the power to defeat the nightmarish foe. In the riverlands, they were joined by Lord Edmund Tully's levies, fresh from their conquest. From the Vale came Lord Ronal Arryn, a boy lord, who had offered fealty to Aegon upon hearing of Harren's fate. He brought knights from the Vale, hoping to glean favor and also to protect his domain from any spillover of undead that might come through the mountains. Farther up the neck, the Crannogmen rose under Howland Reed's ancestors, prepared to use their swamps as a natural defense. The stories of White Walkers turned even the reclusive Crannogmen into uneasy allies of the Targaryens. When at last Aegon's host reached Moat Cailin, perched at the southern edge of the north, they found Torrhen Stark waiting with a great host of Northmen. Tall, fur-clad warriors wielding axes and greatswords, their breath misting in the cold air. Torrhen had not come to wage war against Aegon. Instead, the king in the north knelt before the Black Dread's approach, the wind whipping through his gray-streaked hair. He had heard the rumors of Dragonfire's unstoppable might. More importantly, he had heard from the Night's Watch, and from his own scouts, of the unstoppable terror that lay beyond the wall. Torrhen Stark had chosen wisdom over pride. In that moment, the king in the north surrendered his crown and swore fealty, becoming the first Stark to serve as Warden of the North under Targaryen rule. It was a moment that would live in legend, eventually overshadowed by the even darker myths of what was to come. Aegon, relieved that he did not need to fight another full-scale war in the frigid north, embraced Torrhen Stark as a loyal bannerman. He asked the Northmen for their knowledge, their readiness, and their unwavering hearts, for it was said that only men of the north could withstand the brutality of the coming winter. Torrhen led him northward, across the icy plains, past Winterfell and toward the wall. At intervals, his men would join with the Targaryen host, swelling its numbers. Yet even as their forces grew, the land itself seemed to reject them. The wind was biting, carrying a chill that made warhorses tremble. The days shortened, the nights lengthened. Summer was truly over, and winter threatened to be a long and terrible one, if the White Walkers had indeed returned. At Winterfell, Aegon paused to speak with the lords of the north who had gathered in haste. They told him in grim tones that the others were no children's fable. Their ancestors had faced them thousands of years ago, in the fabled Long Night. The legends recounted how the first men and the children of the forest had united to push them back, forging the wall as both physical and magical defense. But that victory was followed by centuries of forgetting until now. One grizzled old man, who claimed to be a warg, insisted that the others were gathering an army of the dead in the haunted forest beyond the wall. If that was true, they would eventually surge south in unstoppable numbers. Aegon listened, refusing to let fear take hold. He had dragons, and no living man or monster could stand against Dragonfire. The tales from the Age of Heroes said that fire was anathema to these creatures of ice, and if any mortal force could deliver that fire, it was the Targaryen dragons. Leaving half their forces to rest and recuperate at Winterfell, Aegon pressed north with Torrhen Stark and a chosen vanguard of knights, lords, and foot soldiers, determined to see the wall himself. They traveled through ever colder lands, the roads turning to ice beneath their boots, until at last the colossal structure loomed before them. The wall, 700 feet of solid ice stretching impossibly from horizon to horizon. Even Balerian's mass seemed small in comparison. Dark silhouettes of the Night's Watch stood atop the battlements, looking down in wonder at the largest army, and the only dragons they had ever seen. Aegon was greeted by the Lord Commander, a gaunt man named Bryce Stark, a distant cousin to the Starks of Winterfell, who spoke plainly of the dire situation. The Watch had lost many rangers to the others, and too many had risen as whites. Parts of the wall were being tested nightly by small raids of the undead, probing for weaknesses. Even the ancient enchantments woven into the wall seemed to tremble under the strain. The cold was more bitter than any living man had felt in centuries, and wind-blown snowdrifts swallowed entire villages beyond the wall. Some wildlings had fled south, begging shelter, their eyes hollow with terror, speaking of white walkers that rode dead horses. Aegon made a bold promise, one that would define his legacy more than any throne forged in King's Landing. He would burn the others to ash with dragon flame. Where normal steel shattered and set the whites free to rise again, Balerion would scald the very earth black, leaving no trace of them. Visenya and Rhaenys, each in turn, promised that Vhagar and Meraxes would do likewise. The Night's Watch, near despair only days before, found a newfound hope in the arrival of dragon lords. A light blazed in their eyes that had not been there for years. Perhaps not even in the Age of Heroes had the first men possessed a weapon as powerful as a living dragon. The time for talk ended. Scouts from Eastwatch by the Sea reported that a large force of the others, thousands of whites, and an unknown number of white walkers themselves, had been spotted moving toward the coast. The Watch suspected they meant to circle around, cross the frozen waters where the wall dipped into the shivering sea, and slip south into the north. If that happened, the Watchers on the wall would have to divert their forces to guard multiple points, drastically weakening their position. Aegon acted swiftly. He ordered the greatest part of his cavalry and foot to remain behind at Castle Black, manning the wall under the guidance of Torrhen Stark and the Night's Watch. He himself would fly with Balerion to scout the others' position. Visenya and Rhaenys would accompany him. The Targaryen knights who had come north to prove their valor clamored to join, but the raw truth was that mortal men on horseback would struggle to keep pace in the frozen wilderness. Dragons would move faster, strike more decisively, and sow terror in the foe. Still, a small contingent of hardiest Northmen, led by the legendary ranger Benjen Frost, volunteered to follow on foot, though they knew it meant traveling slow and enduring unimaginable cold. Aegon commended their courage, suspecting they might be needed to hold any ground the dragons cleared. And so, before dawn the next day, 3 dragons took flight over the wall. Their silhouettes blocked out the stars, and the blackness of their wings merged with the dark sky, save for the glow of dawn on the horizon. The Northmen who beheld this spectacle felt a swell of awe and trepidation. The realm had never seen dragons in open war against the others. It was a confrontation out of a new myth, more potent than any song. They flew for hours, scanning the white horizon. At last, Rhaenys on Meraxes spotted movement in the distance. An army of the dead that seemed endless, trudging slowly but inexorably southward. The White Walkers led from the front, tall and gaunt, their pale, translucent flesh seeming almost luminescent against the snow. The sky was eerily silent, as if even the wind held its breath. A sense of otherworldly dread coursed through the Targaryens. Visenya banked Vhagar around to approach from behind, and Aegon took Balerion in a wide arc that would bring him in from the east. Rhaenys positioned Meraxes to the west. They planned to converge upon the undead horde, trapping them in a triangle of dragonflame. What happened next would be retold by the few who survived the vantage of the ground. They saw the dragons swoop in, unleashing torrents of flame. Even the coldest winter air melted under such an onslaught. The first wave of whites, once men and beasts, blackened and fell, curling into ash. Some shattered like glass when the intense heat met their frozen flesh. The White Walkers themselves recoiled, their eerie blue eyes fixed upon the dragons with a hatred beyond mortal understanding. They raised their arms, and a freezing mist coalesced, swirling around them in a violent gale that battered at the dragons overhead. Spears of ice, razor-sharp, formed in the air and hurtled upward like arrows. Visenya, ever vigilant, saw this sorcery rising. She urged Vagr higher, narrowly avoiding a barrage of ice lances. One struck Vagr's flank but broke upon the dragon's scales without dealing more than a scratch. The breath of winter warred against Valyrian fire in the sky. Steam hissed and clouds boiled. Yet Balerion was even mightier, his scales thick as steel, his flame hot as the heart of a volcano. Aegon guided him into a sharp dive, breathing black fire upon the largest cluster of wights. The undead legion scattered and shriveled, many crumbling to charred fragments. Another flight across them, and Balerion incinerated an entire line of the living dead. This was but the opening gambit. The White Walkers, seemingly impervious to normal flame in some of the oldest tales, did not fall as easily as the Whites. Aegon saw them standing amidst the inferno, an aura of cold swirling around them that kept the worst of the fire at bay. Yet that aura wavered. The unstoppable press of dragonfire was too intense to fully hold back. Some of the White Walkers retreated, trying to fade into the swirling snowfall. It was then that mare axes roared down from above, Rhaenys guiding her mount to cut off their escape. The dragon breathed a scorching column of flame so powerful that the snow at ground level turned to slush in seconds. 3 of the others were caught in the blaze. Their icy armors cracked. Their otherworldly shrieks cut the air like shards of glass. Then they burst apart into clouds of fractal frost, leaving nothing behind but droplets of water that hissed into steam upon the blackened ground. Visenya, not to be outdone, caught sight of a group of others weaving their freezing sorcery. She urged Vagr to descend swiftly, unleashing a torrent of dragonfire at their flank. Most were consumed, but one, perhaps older or mightier than the rest, held firm behind a shield of frost. The collision of flame and ice created an explosive release of steam that obscured the battlefield. When the mist settled, the White Walker was gone, no sign of its remains. Whether it had been destroyed or fled, none could say. Yet the devastation was vast. In mere moments, entire ranks of wights were reduced to charred remains. The White Walkers, so accustomed to their slow, unstoppable march, had not faced the fury of Valyrian dragons since the dawn of time, if ever. Now, confronted with an adversary that commanded living flame, they faltered. Their unnatural cold could not fully quench the fires that rained upon them from above. Aegon's confidence soared as he witnessed Balyrion's power. It was as he had predicted. The Black Dread was nearly invulnerable to the White Walkers. Their ice lances either shattered or melted on his scales. Their blasts of cold wind dulled the dragonfire only slightly, and in the rare moments when a piece of their frozen magic struck home, Balerion merely roared in fury and responded with even greater ferocity. Dragonfire was life. It could not be snuffed out so easily, certainly not by cold alone. Yet the White Walkers were cunning. They did not simply stand there to be annihilated. Several of them grouped together, forming a wedge that commanded a swirl of snow and ice to blind the dragons. The wind howled, and the swirling white murk rose toward the sky. The Targaryens found themselves momentarily disoriented, the ground a shifting sea of fog and storm. In that confusion, one of the others raised its ice sword high, and the whites surged forward, an unending tide of the dead. If any men had been standing in their way, they would have been slaughtered in moments. But the men on the ground were few and scattered, mostly watchers from the vantage of a distant hill or wildling refugees too terrified to move. Those poor souls in small pockets were indeed overrun. Screams echoed, quickly silenced. Their bodies jerked upright moments later, newly minted whites under White Walker control. Despite these pockets of tragedy, the tide of battle belonged to the dragons. As the storm parted for a moment, Visenya directed Vagr to swoop down again. This time, she spotted a cluster of White Walkers apparently engaged in some dark ritual. They had formed a ring, and a cold mist congealed in the center, swirling with flickers of pale light. Whether they meant to reanimate more corpses or summon an even greater horror, Visenya did not wait to find out. She unleashed Vagr's flame, swirling it around the ring in a wall of fire. The circle was shattered, their magic undone. Several others crumbled, their forms collapsing under the searing onslaught. Aegon, for his part, guided Balerion into a relentless barrage, pass after pass, each time bathing the undead horde in black flame. The once white landscape was scorched black and red, the stench of burning flesh and seared ice filling the frigid air. Whites were turned to nothing, and more than a score of others perished. An accomplishment no single force of men could have dreamed of achieving. At last, the remains of the undead legion, battered and broken, began to retreat northward. The White Walkers who survived slipped away into the gathering storm, the swirling snow and gloom swallowing their pallid forms. The Targaryen dragons soared overhead, unleashing a few more streams of fire in pursuit, but the others vanished into the vastness of the wilderness. Though the Targaryens had won a striking victory, the White Walkers were not annihilated. They had lost a significant portion of their whites and many of their kind, but these creatures were ancient, patient, and had never expected such a foe. Now they knew the power of dragonfire. They would adapt. The fighting died down, leaving the once pristine tundra a smoking wasteland. Rhaenys flew Merax's low, scanning for survivors. She found pockets of trembling wildlings who had witnessed the carnage, their meager weapons clutched in frozen hands. Some cowered, expecting the dragon to devour them. Others stared with wide, vacant eyes, uncertain if they were saved or merely condemned to another horror. Rhaenys called out, urging them to seek refuge south of the wall. Some of them screamed in terror at her voice, uncertain whether they had seen a goddess of flame or a demon from some unimaginable realm. But over time, a small band approached, and she guided them away from the worst of the devastation. Visenya dismounted briefly to inspect the remains of the others. She was greeted with lumps of strange, pale matter that melted rapidly in the aftermath of dragonfire. Their armor, once shimmering ice, was cracked and brittle as dead leaves, dissolving into puddles of water that steamed in the lingering heat. She gathered what scraps she could, suspecting the maesters would want to study the residue. So far from the citadel, knowledge was a precious resource, especially knowledge of this enemy's weaknesses. Aegon observed the field with grim satisfaction. He had proven what he'd hoped. Balerion's black fire could decimate the White Walkers' forces. Yet he also saw how the others had nearly blinded them with conjured storms and illusions. This enemy was no band of savage brutes. They wielded cunning, patience, and supernatural powers that matched or exceeded men's capacity. If the White Walkers regrouped, and Aegon had no doubt they would, he needed a plan to eradicate them utterly. His goal was not merely to drive them back behind the wall. That had already failed once in history. He would burn them until there was nothing left to threaten the realm he meant to rule. He dispatched riders to the wall with news of the victory. Those watchers cheered to know that a great host of undead had been destroyed. Yet Aegon and his sisters did not return to Castle Black at once. Instead, they pressed deeper into the north, braving the polar wilderness. They sought the White Walkers' source of power, or at least any stronghold from which they might launch a final assault. Along the way, they encountered scattered white patrols, newly raised from dead wildlife, bears, wolves, even massive mammoths. Each time, the Targaryens unleashed dragonfire. Each time, they left nothing alive or undead. Yet the deeper they went, the more the storms intensified, and the more often they glimpsed spectral shapes at the edges of their vision. They were being watched, harried even. They soon realized that the land itself was turning against them. The temperature plummeted, the blizzards became fiercer, and the ground grew treacherous with hidden crevasses. Even the dragons showed signs of discomfort, though their internal heat kept them alive. Aegon, seeing that they could be drawn into a trap, chose caution. They would not risk losing a dragon or being isolated in a blizzard strong enough to smother dragonfire. With reluctance, he led the flight back south to the wall. His vow remained firm. He would destroy the White Walkers, but he would do so in a battle of his choosing. Returning to Castle Black, they found Torrhen Stark and the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch busy preparing for a siege. The presence of so many southern knights in the cold environment was not without difficulty. Provisions were running low, and many men struggled with frostbite and sickness. Yet morale had soared with the knowledge that the dragons could defeat the others in open battle. Now, the question became how to lure the others into such a confrontation again, and end them for good. A council was called in the Great Hall of Castle Black. Aegon, his sisters, Torrhen Stark, Bryce Stark, and a handful of high lords and experienced rangers gathered. The debate raged long into the night. Some argued that the Targaryens should scour the lands beyond the wall, burning every inch until the others had nowhere to hide. Others counseled patience, for the Northmen needed time to rest and fortify. The Night's Watch insisted that there were still countless whites out there, and more White Walkers than they had seen in that single battle. Ultimately, Aegon decided that the best course was to secure the wall against any infiltration and systematically raid beyond it with dragons and picked ground troops. Over time, they would whittle down the White Walkers' numbers, preventing them from growing their legion of whites. The Targaryen army, despite the harsh conditions, would hold the line, ensuring that if the others tried a large-scale assault, the dragons would be ready. It was a slow, grinding strategy, but far preferable to a single reckless venture deep into the bitter far north. And so the War for the Dawn, as some would later call it, began in earnest. The War of Conquest in the south, while not fully resolved, had largely concluded with most great houses bending the knee. Now, their men trickled north in small but steady groups to join the watch at the wall. Supplies, however, were a grave concern. The Reach and Westerlands began shipping grain and provisions up the King's Road. The new King's Landing, a primitive settlement at this time, with the first stones of the Red Keep barely laid, became a marshalling point for supplies heading north. The newly loyal lords of the riverlands facilitated shipments up the Neck, across the White Knife, and ultimately to the north. It was a monumental undertaking, forging alliances of logistics as well as of swords. While men and supplies moved along the spine of Westeros, Aegon and his sisters led raids beyond the wall. They grew adept at flushing out pockets of undead, using the dragons to incinerate them before they could mount a defense. In some cases, they discovered entire icy caverns filled with dormant whites, presumably stored there by the others for later use. These they burnt out, collapsing the caves in pillars of molten ice. They also encountered free folk, terrified and half-starved, who either fled in panic or begged for shelter south of the wall. It was on one such raid that Aegon came face to face with what seemed to be a White Walker of high rank, if such a thing existed. The creature stood atop a frozen ridge, clad in reflective ice armor that shimmered in the pale sun, an ornate icicle crown upon its brow. Dark runes, like cracks in a glacier, were etched into its breastplate. It raised a tall spear, shaped from a single shard of ice. No whites flanked it. It stood alone. Aegon, astride Balerion, felt a chill that even the dragon's heat could not fully banish. He bid Balerion descend with caution. The White Walker did not flee or attack immediately. It only stood, gazing up at the black dread with eyes of burning blue. Aegon unleashed Dragonflame, a raging inferno that scorched the ridge. The flames licked around the figure in a brilliant corona of heat. For a moment, it seemed the entire precipice might melt. Then, impossibly, the White Walker still stood. Steam billowed all around it, and cracks ran through its icy armor. But it held firm, raising one hand in a gesture that conjured a localized blizzard, swirling snow and shards of ice around its body. Aegon pressed the attack, intensifying the flame, until the heat became unbearable even for him atop the dragon. The ice armor cracked further. A high, piercing shriek cut the air. Then, abruptly, the figure dissolved, bursting into a shimmer of ice crystals that vanished in the swirling steam. Whether it had been destroyed or merely retreated into some twisted magic, Aegon could not say. But that single confrontation reminded him that these foes possessed a resilience and cunning beyond mortal ken. The raids continued for weeks, turning to months, as the darkest part of winter descended. Each day, the nights lengthened, the winds howled more fiercely. The Targaryens and their allies fought ceaselessly, but the White Walkers proved elusive. They no longer marched in great armies, likely due to the devastation inflicted by the dragons, but they struck whenever they sensed weakness. On nights of bitterest cold, small groups of White Walkers would assault watchtowers or supply caravans, raising new wights from the slain. In the swirling snows and starless nights, entire companies of men disappeared. Even the bravery of southern knights faltered when confronted with foes who did not bleed, who did not speak, and who slaughtered without mercy in the silence of endless winter. The war below the wall threatened to reignite as well. Reports of bandit raids in the Crownlands, Dornish skirmishers testing the borders of the Reach, and Ironborn reavers exploiting the diverted attention all reminded Aegon that the unity of Westeros was not yet absolute. But every time he received such tidings, he would return to the ramparts of Castle Black and gaze northward, recalling the inhuman evil that lurked just out of sight. That was the real enemy, the one that must be destroyed at all costs. Until then, petty disputes among men could wait. Through it all, Balerion remained a symbol of absolute terror to the others. From time to time, the White Walkers would attempt to strike at Aegon's Dreadmount specifically, hurling storms of razor-sharp ice. Once, a massive javelin of packed ice soared straight at Balerion's throat, but the Black Dread's scales proved too thick, too impervious, and the javelin shattered on impact, leaving no more than faint frost on Balerion's black hide. Again and again, Aegon demonstrated that Balerion was effectively invulnerable to their assaults. Whenever the White Walkers gathered in any significant number, the Targaryen dragons would find them and unleash absolute destruction. Although the others might vanish into wind and snow, their whites were consistently annihilated, preventing their forces from growing. Gradually, the undead threat diminished. The final reckoning came when scouts, both wildlings and men of the Night's Watch, reported a large congregation of White Walkers in a place called the Fist of the First Men. The significance of that ancient ringed fort was not lost on the old rangers. It was believed to be a stronghold from the Dawn Age. If the others were gathering there, it likely meant they intended a large-scale incursion. It was a perfect vantage point, high on a plateau offering a commanding view of the surrounding forests. Aegon decided the time had come to strike a decisive blow. Accompanied by Torrhen Stark and a contingent of the best warriors the North could muster, along with a small group of knights from the south, eager for glory, the Targaryens flew forth. Hundreds more men followed on foot, though they would likely not arrive for a day or more. The plan was simple. The dragons would surprise the White Walkers, while the ground forces ensured no whites escaped. This would be the culminating battle to destroy the largest concentration of others left in the far north. They arrived at dawn. The pale light revealed a grim sight. The ridgeline of the Fist was ringed with undead, a veritable army standing in disciplined silence. At the center stood White Walkers, at least 20 of them, their presence exuding a freezing mist. They seemed to be performing some ritual or forging new ice weapons. The watchers from a distance could feel the temperature drop further with every passing moment. This time, there would be no warning. Aegon led the charge from above, Balerion's roar echoing through the icy valley. The undead below raised their heads in unison. The White Walkers tensed. In a flash, 3 dragons descended upon the Fist, Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes. Their combined flames lit the ridge like a festival bonfire. The ring of whites crumpled. The snow evaporated in plumes of steam. The ritual was disrupted, and shards of ice exploded outward. Within seconds, half the undead were ashes. The others rallied, summoning howling winds that battered the dragons. Icy shards pelted their wings, but the dragons pushed through. Rhaenys circled Meraxes around the perimeter, lighting up any whites that tried to flee downhill. Visenya dropped Vhagar right into the midst of the swirling cold, unleashing fire so intense it left the stones glowing. A chorus of inhuman shrieks rent the air. Aegon and Balerion aimed for the largest cluster of others at the heart of the Fist. They perched momentarily atop an outcropping of black rock, from which Aegon surveyed the carnage. The White Walkers were in disarray. Some, battered by the unstoppable flames, had already fallen. Others maintained small bastions of cold that repelled the initial fire. Aegon singled out one that seemed taller, more intricately armored. perhaps a commander among them. He urged Balerion forward, releasing an inferno. The White Walker tried to counter with swirling snow, but the black flames were unstoppable. With a final, defiant glare, the Walker shattered, leaving nothing but molten ice. The rest, seeing their fellows destroyed, attempted to coordinate a retreat. A swirling gale of sleet obscured the ridge. But the Targaryen dragons had learned their tactics by now. They soared back and forth, creating overlapping cones of flame that left no gap for the others to slip through. In pockets, the White Walkers made desperate stands. Their ice swords clashed with the swords of brave Northmen who arrived late to the fray, though most mortal men fared poorly unless they wielded Valyrian steel or dragonglass. Yet, with the dragons overhead, the White Walkers found no respite. In a matter of hours, the entire position on the Fist of the First Men was overrun. The Whites were obliterated. The White Walkers, every last one that had been present, lay in pieces of ice and steaming pools of water. At the battle's end, as the triumphant warriors gathered among the charred remains, a hush fell across them. They realized they had witnessed the near-total destruction of a legend that had haunted the earliest memories of men. For a moment, no one spoke. Then a ragged cheer broke out among the Northmen, echoed by the knights from the south. The Targaryens stood triumphant on the high ridge, dragons roaring flames into the sky in a display of raw power. In the days that followed, rangers scoured the surrounding lands for any sign of surviving others. Some pockets of whites still roamed aimlessly, but the animating will behind them seemed absent or greatly weakened. The White Walkers had not all been there, of course. Some had fled deeper into the northern wastes, but their force was broken, their march south stymied, and their numbers decimated. With the dragons in the skies and the Night's Watch vigilant, it seemed impossible for them to rebuild that army. At last, it appeared the realm might know peace, under Aegon's fiery aegis. Aegon Targaryen, back at the wall, received accolades unlike any seen in Westeros. Torrhen Stark, the once king in the north, knelt in reverence, acknowledging Aegon not merely as a conqueror but as a savior. The Lord Commander of the Night's Watch thanked him in words formal yet deeply felt. "We remember. We always will." Visenya and Rhaenys were hailed as heroines, though Visenya's proud mien deflected praise, and Rhaenys' laughing eyes seemed to promise that they would yet celebrate. Word reached south, spreading to all corners of the realm. The conquest had been achieved not only by fire and blood, but by saving the living from a threat out of the darkest nightmares. With the north secured, Aegon's next steps were to finalize the subjugation of the few remaining pockets of resistance in Westeros, chiefly Dorne, which had not bent the knee. Yet the impetus behind any further wars shifted. Aegon was no longer merely the Dragon Lord who had come to conquer. He was the protector of the realm, the one who had turned back the long night. Even in Dorne, small folk whispered that defiance against this Targaryen king was futile. He had, after all, burned the others and survived. How could spears or scorpions match that? A moon's turn later, the Targaryens and their vassals began the long trek south. At every castle on the King's Road, lords and ladies vied for a glimpse of Balerion, the Black Dread, and the man who had saved all humankind. Even the Faith of the Seven, once wary of these Valyrian interlopers, saw in Aegon's victories a sign of the crone's wisdom guiding him to banish the darkness. The small folk who lined the roads cheered for the dragons, for they believed that, with such creatures on their side, no winter's terror would ever again haunt their nights. Yet Aegon himself was not lulled into complacency. He had studied the White Walkers' cunning and recognized that if any survived, they would wait, biding their time. He called upon the lords and knights to remember the cost of forgetting. He commanded that watch be kept along the wall, that the Night's Watch be well-funded and never again left to dwindle. And, in an unprecedented move, he dispatched messages to the Citadel, urging the maesters to gather every scrap of knowledge on the Long Night and the White Walkers, so that future generations would be prepared. The forging of a new realm under one throne meant little if it did not safeguard against the nightmares that lurked in the unknown. Still, in the hearts of most, the threat seemed vanquished. Even in the north, a sense of relief bloomed. Soon, stories of the White Walkers' defeat overshadowed the memories of horror. If men are consistent in any respect, it is in their ability to forget the lessons of tragedy once the immediate danger has passed. But for now, at least, a watchful peace reigned, enforced by the living embodiment of fire itself, the dragons. When Aegon finally reached King's Landing once more, he found the beginnings of what would become the grand city of the realm. Wooden palisades were going up, and plans were made for stone walls. The Iron Throne, newly forged from the swords of his conquered enemies, awaited him in a half-built hall. Yet as Aegon approached that crude seat of iron, twisted and sharp, he felt a pang of perspective. This throne, though a symbol of his conquest, was but iron in the end. True power lay with the dragons and the unity they had inspired. He ascended the throne not out of pride or vanity, but out of a sense of responsibility. The realm was his to rule and to protect. His coronation was a somber affair, overshadowed by the knowledge of the war fought in the cold north. Bards who had accompanied the army made songs of the battles against the White Walkers, weaving epic tales of Balerion turning the snowfields to black glass, of Vagr shattering storms, of Meraxes bringing final death to the undead. Yet Aegon's only real pride was in the knowledge that the 7 kingdoms, or 6, for Dorne remained stubborn, were largely at peace, and that peace, he believed, was secured by the memory of draconic fury unleashed against the darkness. As the months turned to years, skirmishes flared again in Dorne. Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys would each lead campaigns to bring the Desert Kingdom under Targaryen rule. Those wars would become bloody and complex, culminating in a partial stalemate that forced Aegon to acknowledge that dragons, while unstoppable against white monsters in open fields, could not so easily subjugate a people adept at guerrilla tactics in the mountains and deserts. Yet even as these conflicts wore on, the events of the far north lingered like a dream half-remembered. Messengers still traveled to and from the Wall, ensuring that the Night's Watch was well supplied. It became part of Aegon's royal policy to send gold, grain, and men to the Wall every year, a tradition that would persist in varying strengths under his successors. His experience had proven that ignoring the Watchers on that colossal barrier was a fool's gamble. The lords of the realm, even the proudest among them, tended to heed Aegon's commands, for they had seen, or at least heard credible reports, of what happened when the White Walkers faced Dragonfire. The unity enforced by the crown was not a mere whim of a conquering tyrant. It was the last bulwark against a threat that could have destroyed them all. In this sense, the rise of House Targaryen to supreme power was made smoother and faster than it might otherwise have been. For nothing unites a realm like a common enemy, and the White Walkers had served as the darkest of foes. In the halls of Winterfell, Torrhen Stark lived out his years as the first warden of the North under Targaryen rule. His line persisted, loyal and watchful, ensuring the roads north were guarded. The Stark words, "Winter is coming," once uttered in a gloom of inevitability, now carried a warning that everyone knew was real. For winter had come, and in its darkest hour, dragons had answered. The memory of that salvation bound the North to the throne, forging an alliance of necessity as well as respect. Meanwhile, the Night's Watch faced a slow resurgence in prestige. Tales of their heroic stands, and the knowledge that they had played a part, however small, in comparison to dragons, in driving back the White Walkers, drew new recruits. Some noble families, eager to prove their honor, sent younger sons to join the black-clad ranks. The Watch improved its fortifications, reopened some of its abandoned castles along the Wall, and kept a vigilant eye on the lands beyond. They found no sign of a renewed White Walker presence, though they remained prepared for any flicker of unnatural cold or blue-eyed terror. As for Aegon, the nightmares he had once sensed in drifting dragon dreams gradually faded, replaced by visions of a unified continent and the bright forging of a dynasty that would last for centuries. Yet in the quietest hours of night, when the wind rattled the windows of the Red Keep and the cinders in the fireplace glowed like dying embers, he sometimes remembered the shrieks of the others, the howling wind, and the swirl of steam as Balerian's flame clashed with impossible cold. He had looked upon that primal darkness and emerged victorious. If ever the White Walkers dared to return, Aegon believed, House Targaryen's dragons would be there to burn them anew. And so it was, in the time after Aegon's conquest, that men told a new chapter in the ancient myths. Once the others had returned, but fire answered ice. Where once the realm might have dissolved into bitter feuds and endless petty wars, the threat of a common extinction forced the Seven Kingdoms to unite under the might of House Targaryen. And in that unity, they found the strength to survive the long night once more. The darkest legends of the past met the living dragons of the present, and the realm was saved. In the hearts of the people, Aegon the Conqueror would always be remembered not merely as a king on an iron throne, but as a flaming sword held against the chill of annihilation. His heirs would hold the kingdom he forged, if they could, yet none could deny that his legacy was sealed the day he flew Balerion into the heart of winter and brought fire to the icy dawn. Even in Dorne, minstrels told of the day dragonfire lit the north sky like an aurora, reflecting off the wall in colorful bands. And though the Dornish might have prayed for Aegon's downfall in their desert struggles, few in Westeros, whether friend or foe, could deny that on the matter of the White Walkers, the Targaryen had stood between life and death for the entire continent. Thus did Aegon's conquest become more than a subjugation. It became a salvation, hastened by the return of an ancient evil. No matter how the ages that followed would interpret it, whether as an inevitable Targaryen triumph or a heroic stand of men, the essential truth remained. The White Walkers had re-emerged, bringing with them the specter of an endless night. Yet in that time, a man who rode the Black Dread proved that even the coldest darkness could be seared away by dragonfire. And so the realm was made whole, fire and blood forging a new era where the living could thrive in the wake of victory over death itself.